The last thing Hyun-woo remembered was the smell of burning. Not wood, not candles, his own skin. The arc flash hit him at 35,000 volts, and the world went white, and then black, and then nowhere at all. He died standing up, with his hand still on the breaker panel at Incheon substation number 4. He was 26 years old, and he did not even have time to be afraid. Then he opened his eyes, and the world smelled like horse dung and rotting straw and something sour he could not name. He was lying on a dirt floor. His hands were small and thin and caked with grime. His back ached in 3 places. His mouth tasted like copper. He sat up and hit his head on a low wooden beam, and the pain was so sharp and real that he knew immediately this was not a dream. The room was barely a room. 4 walls of rough stone, a single window no bigger than a man's fist, no glass, just a rag stuffed into the gap. The light that crept in was gray and weak, and it told him nothing about where he was or when he was. He looked at his hands again. These were not his hands. The fingers were thinner. The knuckles were scraped raw. There was a burn scar on the left palm shaped like a crescent, and he had never seen it before in his life. He stood up slowly, and his body protested every movement. He was shorter than before, lighter, younger maybe. He found a bucket of water in the corner and looked down into it, and the face staring back was not Lee Hyeon-woo, the engineer from Ansan. It was a boy, 18 maybe, hollow cheeks, dark circles under the eyes, a bruise on the jaw that was turning yellow at the edges. He touched the bruise, and the boy in the water touched it too, and the wrongness of it made his stomach clench. He did not scream. He did not panic. He stood there for a long time looking at that face and breathing slowly through his nose the way he used to do before entering a live switchgear room. Calm first, information second, panic never. He searched the room. There was a straw pallet on the floor where he had been lying, a wooden stool with one leg shorter than the others, a shelf with a cracked clay bowl and a spoon, a pile of rags that might once have been clothing, and on a nail by the door, a leather apron black with soot and oil, a worker's apron, an apprentice's apron. He put it on. It fit. Under the shelf, he found a small sack with a few copper coins inside. He counted them, 7. He had no idea what they were worth, but they were light and thin, and he guessed not much. He opened the door. The street outside was narrow and unpaved, and the mud was ankle-deep in places. The buildings were timber and stone, with thatched roofs, and the smell of smoke hung in the air from a dozen chimneys. People moved past in rough clothing. A woman carrying a basket of turnips. A man pulling a handcart loaded with firewood. 2 children chasing a dog through the muck. No cars. No power lines, no street lights, no concrete. He looked up and saw no contrails in the sky. No satellites. No glow of a city on the horizon. Just gray clouds and silence. This was not Korea. This was not anywhere he had ever been. A boy ran past and shouted something, and it took Hyun-woo a moment to realize he understood the words. The language sat in his head like it had always been there. The boy had said, "Get out of the way, you idiot." Hyun-woo stepped aside and began walking. He walked for an hour through the town. He learned its shape without trying. The market square at the center, the well, the blacksmith's forge that belched smoke and rang with hammer blows, the tanner's yard that stank so badly he crossed the street, the temple on the hill with a symbol he did not recognize carved above its doors. And then he saw it, the thing that changed everything. He came around a corner and there was a crowd gathered in the square, maybe 30 people. They stood in a rough circle, looking up at a man on a raised wooden platform. The man wore robes of deep blue, embroidered with silver thread. His hair was white and pulled back, and his hands were raised above his head. Beside him stood a glass sphere the size of a melon, mounted on a bronze stand. The crowd was silent. The man in blue spoke in a low voice and moved his fingers in a slow, deliberate pattern, and the glass sphere began to glow. It started faint, then brighter, then bright enough to cast shadows on the faces below. The crowd gasped. Some knelt. A woman pressed her hands together and bowed her head. The man in blue held the light for 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then he lowered his hands and the glow faded, and the crowd erupted in murmurs of awe and gratitude. A mage. That was the word that rose from the crowd. A mage of the tower, blessed by the gods. Hyun-woo did not kneel. He stood at the back of the crowd and stared at the glass sphere, and his mind was doing something it had done 1,000 times before. It was diagnosing. The glow was steady, not flickering like flame. The color was warm white, around 3,000 Kelvin if he had to guess. The intensity was maybe 40 lumens, enough to light a small room, but nothing extraordinary. The sphere itself was glass, transparent. The light originated from the center. No visible filament, no gas discharge pattern. It looked for all the world like an incandescent point source suspended in vacuum. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from recognition. He knew what that was. Strip away the robes and the chanting and the silver thread and the kneeling crowd, and what you had was a light source, a point of energy being converted to visible radiation. Whether it was magic or not did not matter. What mattered was the output, and the output was light. Just light. Ordinary photons bouncing off ordinary retinas. And Lee Hyun-woo could make photons. He could make a lot of photons. He walked back to his tiny room and sat on the stool and put his head in his hands and thought. He thought about copper wire, about zinc plates, about sulfuric acid, about Alessandro Volta, who built the first battery in 1800 from nothing more than metal discs and brine-soaked cardboard. He thought about Michael Faraday, who proved that a spinning magnet near a coil of wire produces current. He thought about Thomas Edison and his carbonized bamboo filament glowing in a glass bulb from which the air had been pumped out. He thought about all the things he knew: Ohm's law, Kirchhoff's laws, electromagnetic induction, resistance, capacitance, impedance, three-phase power distribution. He had spent 4 years at university learning these things, and 4 more years applying them with his hands on real copper and real steel in real substations that powered a city of 10 million people. And now he was sitting in a room with a dirt floor, in a world that thought light was a gift from the gods. He almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he picked up one of the copper coins from the sack and held it up to the thin gray light from the window. Copper. Real copper. He could feel the weight of it. He could feel its conductivity in his bones, the way a musician feels a tuning fork. He needed more copper. He needed zinc. He needed acid. He needed wire. He needed glass. He needed tools. He had 7 coins and 2 borrowed hands and a head full of knowledge that this world would burn him alive for possessing. But he also had something the mage on that platform would never have. He had the ability to teach someone else to do what he could do. The mage's light died when the mage lowered his hands. The light Hyun-woo would build would burn whether he was there or not. It would burn for anyone. That was the difference between a miracle and a machine. A miracle needs a priest. A machine just needs a manual. The next morning, Hyun-woo went to the forge. He knew where it was from yesterday's walk, and he knew the sound of it before he turned the corner. The steady ring of hammer on iron, the hiss of quenching steel, the low roar of bellows feeding a coal fire. The smithy was an open-fronted building with a stone chimney wide enough for a man to stand inside. At the anvil stood a broad-shouldered figure with arms like knotted rope and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same iron he worked. This was Dohan. Hyun-woo knew the name the way he knew the language. It was already in the body's memory. Master Dohan. The man who owned this forge and who owned the labor of the apprentice whose skin Hyun-woo now wore. Dohan looked up when Hyun-woo approached, and his expression was not welcoming. He told Hyun-woo he was late. He told him the coal needed breaking and the bellows needed mending, and the order for 16 horse nails was due by evening. He said all of this without stopping his hammer and without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. Hyun-woo picked up the coal hammer and got to work. For 3 days, he did nothing but what Dohan told him to do. He broke coal. He pumped bellows until his shoulders burned. He swept ash. He carried water from the well. He ate what Dohan gave him, which was dark bread and thin soup, and sometimes a piece of dried fish that tasted like salt and regret. He did not complain. He watched. He watched Dohan work the forge and saw a man who understood metal the way Hyun-woo understood circuits. Dohan could judge the temperature of iron by its color alone. Cherry red for bending, bright orange for welding, white for cutting. He could draw wire by hand through a series of stone dies, each one slightly smaller than the last. He could hammer a sheet of copper thin enough to see light through. These were the skills Hyun-woo needed. On the 4th morning, Hyun-woo asked Dohan a question. He asked where the copper came from. Dohan gave him a long look. Then he said the copper came from the traders out of Velcour to the south. Ingots mostly, sometimes raw ore that needed smelting. It was expensive. Why was the boy asking about copper when he should be breaking coal? Hyun-woo said nothing more that day, but the question had opened a door. Over the next few days, he asked more. Always one question at a time, always while working, never stopping his hands while his mouth moved. Where did the zinc come from? Dohan said zinc. What would a boy want with zinc? Hyun-woo said he had seen it used in coating iron to prevent rust. Dohan's eyebrows went up half an inch. That was the most surprise Hyun-woo had seen on that stone face. Dohan said the galvanizers in Velcour used zinc for exactly that purpose, but it was dear stuff and hard to get pure. He asked where the boy had learned about zinc coating. Hyun-woo said he had heard a traveling merchant mention it. The lie sat in his mouth like a pebble, but Dohan seemed to accept it. On the 7th day, Hyun-woo asked about acid. This time, Dohan put down his hammer. He turned and looked at Hyun-woo with eyes that had seen 50 years of fire and metal and foolishness. And he asked what exactly the boy was planning. Hyun-woo had prepared for this moment. He told Dohan that he wanted to try something, an experiment. He said he believed he could make a piece of metal produce a steady warmth without fire. Dohan stared at him for a long time. Then he said the boy had been hit on the head too many times and went back to his anvil. But he did not say no. That evening, Hyun-woo went to the market. He had saved 4 of his 7 copper coins, and he had earned 2 more from Dohan for a week's labor. 6 coins. He found a trader selling scrap metal and bought a handful of copper strips cut from old pots. They were thin and uneven, but they were copper, and that was enough. Zinc was harder. He asked 3 metalworkers before he found one who had zinc scraps left over from a galvanizing job. The man wanted 5 coins for a fistful. Hyun-woo bargained him down to 3. He walked away with copper in one pocket and zinc in the other, and he felt like a man carrying gold. Now he needed acid. Not hydrochloric, not nitric. Those would be nearly impossible to find in a pre-industrial economy. But vinegar was acetic acid diluted, and vinegar was everywhere. He bought a small clay jug of the cheapest wine vinegar in the market for half a coin. He carried everything back to his room and laid it out on the floor. Copper strips, zinc scraps, a jug of vinegar, a cracked clay bowl from the shelf. He sat cross-legged and began to work. He cut the copper into rectangular plates using a small knife he had borrowed from the forge. He did the same with the zinc. His hands remembered the theory even as his muscles struggled with the crude tools. A galvanic cell is simple. Two dissimilar metals separated by an electrolyte. Copper is the cathode, zinc is the anode. The electrolyte allows ions to flow between them. The potential difference between copper and zinc and acetic acid is roughly 1 volt per cell, barely enough to feel. But stack them in series and the voltage adds up. He soaked strips of cloth in vinegar. He stacked copper, then cloth, then zinc, then cloth, then copper again, over and over. He built 12 cells. His hands were shaking by the time he finished. Not from effort, from anticipation. He touched a piece of thin iron wire to both ends of the stack. Nothing visible happened, but he licked his finger and touched the wire and felt it. A tingle. Faint but unmistakable. Current. Actual electric current flowing through a circuit in a world that had never seen a circuit before. He sat back and stared at the crude pile of metal and wet cloth on his floor, and his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. 1 volt. Maybe 1.5. Not enough to light anything. Not enough to heat anything. Not enough to do any useful work at all. But it was real. The electrons were moving. The chemistry was right. The physics did not care what world it was in. Ohm's law held. Faraday's law held. Charge was conserved. The universe was consistent. He needed more cells. He needed purer acid. He needed better contact between the plates. He needed wire, real copper wire, thin and long and insulated. Do-han could draw wire. Hyun-woo had seen him do it. Tomorrow he would ask. Tomorrow he would begin building something that could actually produce visible output. But tonight he sat in his dark little room with his 12-cell vinegar battery and pressed his finger to the wire and felt that tiny bite of current. And he smiled, for the first time since he had died. The next morning, Hyun-woo arrived at the forge before dawn. Do-han was already there, because Do-han was always there. The coals from the previous night were banked and glowing, and the old man was drinking something hot from a clay cup. Hyun-woo told him he needed copper wire, thin as Do-han could draw it, and long as possible. Do-han asked how much copper he had. Hyun-woo showed him the strips. Do-han picked one up and turned it in his fingers and said this was scrap, impure, full of tin and lead. Drawing it thin would be a waste because it would break. He said if the boy wanted proper wire, he needed proper copper, and proper copper cost proper money. Hyun-woo asked how much. Do-han named a figure that was more than Hyun-woo would earn in 2 months. The number hit him like cold water. He had built a battery from scraps and vinegar and felt like a genius, and now the next step cost more than he could imagine earning. He thanked Do-han and went to pump the bellows, and for the rest of the day he thought about money. He thought about what he had and what he could do with it. He could not sell electricity because he could not yet make enough to demonstrate. He could not sell knowledge because knowledge here was heresy. He needed a product, something this world already valued, that he could make better or cheaper or faster using what he knew. And then he remembered something. Do-han's quenching. The old smith cooled his worked iron in a trough of water, sometimes oil. He judged the temperature by eye and by experience, and he was good at it. But Hyun-woo knew something Do-han did not. He knew that the temperature at which you quench steel determines its hardness. Quench too hot and the steel is brittle. Quench too cool and it stays soft. The difference between a blade that holds an edge and a blade that shatters is a matter of maybe 50 degrees. And Hyun-woo knew how to measure temperature precisely, not with a mercury thermometer. He did not have mercury, but with a thermocouple, 2 different metals joined at one end. When the junction is heated, it produces a tiny voltage proportional to the temperature. He had copper, he had zinc, he had a battery that could serve as a reference. He could build a thermocouple and calibrate it against the boiling point of water and the freezing point of water. And then he would have something no smith in this world had ever possessed. A way to measure heat with numbers instead of guesses. Hyun-woo built the thermocouple that night. He twisted one end of a copper strip around one end of a zinc strip until they were joined tight. He connected the free ends to the two poles of his vinegar battery through a short length of iron wire. The wire was not ideal. Iron has high resistance, but it was what he had. He dipped the joined end into a cup of boiling water he had heated over a candle and watched the iron wire. Nothing visible. But when he touched the wire, he felt a change in the current. A slight increase. He needed a way to see the change, not just feel it. He needed a meter. He thought about it for an hour, sitting on the floor with his back against the cold stone wall. Then he remembered the simplest galvanometer ever built, a compass needle and a coil of wire. He did not have a compass, but he had something almost as good. He had a sewing needle from the pile of rags in his room. And he had a piece of lodestone he had seen in the scrap bin at Doan's forge. Lodestone. Natural magnetite. The original compass material. He had walked past it a dozen times without thinking, and now it was the most valuable thing in his world. The next morning, he palmed the lodestone from the scrap bin while Doan's back was turned. It was small, barely the size of his thumbnail, dark and rough and unremarkable. Doan would never miss it. He stroked the sewing needle against the lodestone 50 times in the same direction. Then he balanced the needle on a tiny chip of wood floating in the cup of water. The needle swung slowly and settled pointing in one direction. North. He had a compass. Now he wrapped the iron wire in a tight coil around the cup just below the waterline. 20 turns. 30. As many as the wire would allow. When current from the battery flowed through the coil, it would create a magnetic field and the needle would deflect. The stronger the current, the greater the deflection. When the thermocouple junction was heated, the current would change and the needle would move. Temperature in, needle movement out. A crude but functional pyrometer built from a sewing needle and a stolen rock. He tested it that evening. Cold water, the needle sat still. Warm water heated by candle, the needle twitched. Boiling water. The needle swung a full finger's width to the left. He marked the position for boiling on the rim of the cup with a scratch from the knife. Then he took the cup outside into the night air and packed snow around the thermocouple junction. The needle swung back past center and settled to the right. He marked that too. 2 reference points, 0 and 100 in Celsius. The space between them was linear enough for crude work. He had a thermometer. The first thermometer in the history of this world. And it had cost him a stolen lodestone and a sewing needle and an evening's patience. He brought it to Dohan the next morning. He did not explain the theory. He did not mention electricity or current or magnetic fields. He simply told the old smith that he had built a tool that could tell how hot metal was. Dohan looked at the cup with the floating needle and the coiled wire and the 2 metal strips dangling from it, and his expression suggested he was considering whether the boy had gone completely mad. Hyun-woo asked him to heat a piece of iron in the forge. Dohan shrugged and thrust a rod into the coals. When the iron glowed cherry red, Hyun-woo pressed the thermocouple junction against it with a pair of tongs. The needle in the cup swung hard to the left and stopped. Hyun-woo said that is roughly 800 degrees. Dohan asked, 800 degrees of what? Hyun-woo said it was a measurement of heat, like measuring length with a ruler, but for temperature. The hotter the metal, the further the needle moves. He pointed to the marks on the cup. This mark is boiling water. This mark is ice. The needle is now far past boiling. Dohan stared at the needle. Then he pulled the iron from the coals and quenched it in the trough. and the steel hissed and spat, and the needle swung back. He heated the iron again, this time to a brighter color, orange. The needle went further. Hyun-woo said, "That is about 950. Do-han was quiet for a long time. He heated a third piece, bright yellow-white. The needle nearly hit the edge of the cup. Hyun-woo said, "Over 1100. Too hot for a good blade. The grain structure will be wrong." Do-han put down the tongs. He looked at Hyun-woo, and for the first time there was something other than irritation in his eyes. It was not trust, not yet, but it was attention, real attention. The kind a craftsman gives to a tool that might actually work. Do-han asked how the boy knew that 1100 was too hot for a blade. Hyun-woo said he had studied metal. The properties change with temperature. There is a range where steel is hardest and holds an edge best. Outside that range, it becomes brittle or soft. If you can measure the exact temperature, you can hit that range every time. Every blade perfect, every tool reliable. No more guessing. Do-han picked up the cup and looked at the needle floating on its chip of wood, and he turned it slowly in his scarred hands. Then he said the boy should show him again. They spent the rest of the day testing. Do-han heated iron and steel to every color he knew, and Hyun-woo called out numbers and marked them. Cherry red, 800. Bright red, 900. Orange, 1000. Yellow, 1100. White, above 1200. By evening, Do-han had something he had never had before, a scale, a map of heat that replaced a lifetime of guessing with numbers he could repeat and teach. He sat on his anvil and drank water and looked at Hyun-woo and said the boy was either a genius or a witch, and he had not yet decided which. Hyun-woo said he was neither. He was just someone who paid attention to how things work. Do-han grunted. Then he asked what the boy needed. Hyun-woo told him. He needed pure copper, enough to draw into thin wire. He needed more zinc. He needed stronger acid than vinegar. He needed glass. He needed tools for fine work. And he needed Do-han to keep quiet about what he had seen today. Do-han asked why the secrecy. Hyun-woo told him the truth, or part of it. He said the tower would not look kindly on a device that measures what only mages claim to understand. The tower controls knowledge. A tool that gives knowledge to anyone who holds it is not a curiosity. It is a threat. Do-han's face changed. The word tower did something to him that nothing else had. His jaw tightened and his eyes went hard and flat. He said he knew what the tower did to men who asked too many questions. He said he had known such a man once. He did not say more, and Hyun-woo did not press. But the old smith stood up and walked to a locked chest in the back of the forge, and opened it with a key he wore around his neck. Inside were ingots. Copper. Pure smelted copper, the color of sunset. Enough to draw 100 meters of wire. Do-han set 2 ingots on the anvil. He told Hyun-woo he would draw the wire himself. Finest gauge, no charge. But the boy would tell him everything. Not tomorrow, not later. Everything. Hyun-woo looked at the copper glowing warm in the forge light, and at the old man with his scarred hands and his hard eyes, and he made a decision. He told Do-han that what he was about to say would sound impossible. He told him that the device in the cup was not magic. It was a property of metal and heat that anyone could learn. He told him there were other properties, other devices. He said he could build a thing that makes light. Not fire, not candles, not magic. Light, from metal and wire and acid. Light that anyone could make. Light that did not need a mage. Do-han was silent for a very long time. The forge crackled. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. Then the old smith picked up his hammer and pointed it at Hyun-woo, and said if the boy was lying, he would break his legs. And if he was telling the truth, he would need more than 2 ingots. Do-han drew the wire the next morning. He heated the copper to a dull red and pulled it through his stone dies, one pass at a time. Each pass made it thinner. Each pass made it longer. By noon, he had a coil of copper wire as thick as a grass stem and nearly 60 meters long. It was rough by modern standards, uneven in places, but it was copper and it conducted, and that was all Hyun-woo needed. He spent the rest of the day winding the wire into coils, tight, even coils around a wooden dowel. He made 4 coils of different sizes. The largest was 50 turns. The smallest was 10. He connected the largest coil to his battery stack and held the sewing needle compass near it. The needle jumped. A magnetic field. Weak, but real. Then he slid a nail through the center of the coil. The needle jumped harder. An electromagnet. He could feel the pull against the nail when current flowed. He reversed the connections. The needle swung the other direction. He was grinning, and his hands were shaking, and Do-han was watching from the anvil with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Hyun-woo told him this was a magnet made from electricity. Do-han said he could see that. He asked what it was good for. Hyun-woo said everything. But first, he needed to show Do-han something else. He disconnected the battery. He took the smaller coil and connected it to the compass needle setup. No battery this time, just the coil and the needle. Then he took a piece of lodestone and shoved it quickly through the center of the coil. The needle twitched. He pulled the lodestone out. The needle twitched in the other direction. Do-han leaned forward. Hyun-woo did it again. In, twitch. Out, twitch. He explained. Moving a magnet through a coil of wire creates current. Moving current through a coil of wire creates a magnet. They are the same thing, 2 sides of one coin. This is how you make electricity without a battery. You spin a magnet near a coil and the coil produces current forever. As long as the magnet spins, the current flows. Do-han asked what spins the magnet. Hyun-woo said anything. A hand crank, a water wheel, a horse walking in circles, wind. Do-han looked at the coil and the lodestone and the twitching needle, and Hyun-woo could see the old smith's mind working. Do-han was not an educated man. He could not read. He did not know the word electron or the word induction, but he understood force and motion and metal better than most engineers Hyun-woo had ever met. And right now, he was seeing a connection that changed his understanding of the world. He said, so a water wheel turns a magnet, and the magnet makes this force you call electricity, and the electricity makes light. Hyun-woo nodded. Do-han said that is what the tower does. Hyun-woo said yes, except the tower uses whatever they use and calls it divine gift. And I use copper wire and a spinning rock and call it physics. The result is the same. Light, heat, force. The difference is that anyone can learn to spin a rock. Do-han sat down heavily on his stool. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked how the boy planned to make light from this twitching needle. Hyun-woo told him he needed to build a proper battery first. The vinegar cells were too weak. He needed stronger acid. Sulfuric acid would be ideal, but he did not know how to obtain it here. Do-han surprised him. He said the tanners use a substance they call burning water. It eats through leather if applied wrong, and it eats through skin even faster. They buy it from an alchemist in the Eastern Quarter. Hyun-woo felt a surge of hope. Burning water. That could be sulfuric acid, or hydrochloric, or nitric. Any of them would work better than vinegar. He asked Do-han to take him to the alchemist. Do-han said he would do no such thing. Alchemists were half mad and wholly untrustworthy, and the Eastern Quarter smelled like a dead goat. But he gave Hyun-woo directions. The alchemist shop was a low stone building wedged between a dye works and an abandoned tannery. The smell confirmed Do-han's assessment. Inside was a chaos of glass vessels and clay jars and dried things hanging from the ceiling that Hyun-woo did not want to identify. The alchemist was a thin, nervous man named Oradan, who squinted at Hyun-woo with suspicion and asked what a smith's boy wanted with burning water. Hyun-woo said he needed it for cleaning metal. Oradan laughed and said that was a new excuse. He had 3 kinds. The first was pale and fumed in the air and smelled sharp. Hydrochloric acid. Hyun-woo recognized the behavior instantly. The second was oily and thick and nearly colorless. Hyun-woo asked to see it react with copper. Oradan dripped a tiny amount onto a copper coin, and the surface fizzed and turned blue-green. Sulfuric acid. The real thing. Probably impure, probably contaminated with half the periodic table, but sulfuric acid nonetheless. He asked the price. Oradan named a number that made Hyun-woo's stomach drop. A full jug cost more than he earned in a month. He bought the smallest amount Oradan would sell, a cup, barely enough to fill his palm. He carried it back to the forge wrapped in cloth and held away from his body like it was a live snake. That night, he rebuilt the battery. Copper plates, zinc plates, cloth soaked in diluted sulfuric acid instead of vinegar. 12 cells wired in series. He connected the compass galvanometer, and the needle did not just twitch, it slammed to the side and stayed there. The current was 5 or 6 times stronger than the vinegar version, maybe more. He disconnected the battery and reconnected it through a thin piece of iron wire, the shortest piece he had, maybe 5 centimeters long. He watched. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wire began to change color. A faint red glow appeared at the thinnest point. It grew brighter, orange, then yellow, then white. The wire was incandescent. It was burning with electrical resistance heating, and for 3 seconds, maybe 4, it glowed white-hot in the darkness of his tiny room. Then it melted and broke, and the glow died. But those 3 seconds were enough. Hyun-woo sat in the dark with the smell of hot iron in his nose, and his eyes still seeing the afterimage of that white glow burned into his vision. He had made light. Not a candle, not a torch, not magic. Electrical light. In a world that had never seen it. In a room with a dirt floor. From scrap metal and acid bought from a half-mad alchemist. 3 seconds of light that proved everything. He needed it to last longer. He needed a filament that would not melt. He needed a way to keep the filament from burning in air. He needed glass for a bulb and a way to remove the air from inside it. He needed more power. He needed a better battery or a generator. He needed everything. But the principle was proven. The physics worked. The same physics that powered Seoul and Tokyo and New York worked in this room, in this world, in this body that was not his. He wrapped up the battery carefully and hid it under the straw pallet. He lay down and stared at the ceiling, and his mind was racing through problems and solutions. Carbon. He needed carbon for the filament. Charcoal was everywhere. He could carbonize a strip of bamboo or cotton thread by heating it without air. Vacuum. He could not build a vacuum pump yet, but he could fill the bulb with an inert atmosphere. Wood ash heated to high temperature releases carbon dioxide. Not inert, but close enough. It would slow the oxidation of the filament and buy him minutes instead of seconds. Glass. Do-han did not work glass, but someone in this town must. He would find them. Tomorrow. Tonight, he lay in the dark and counted problems on his fingers. And every problem had a solution. And every solution needed materials. And every material needed money. And money needed a product he could sell. The thermocouple had impressed Do-han, but it would not sell to the market. He needed something visible. Something dramatic. Something that would make a merchant open his purse without asking questions. 3 seconds of light in a dark room. That was his proof of concept. Now he needed to turn 3 seconds into 3 hours. He found the glassblower on the south end of town, a woman named Marga with thick arms and a face reddened by years of working near a furnace. She made bottles and jars and window panes for the few who could afford them. Hyun-woo asked if she could make a hollow glass sphere the size of a fist with a narrow neck. Marga said she could make a glass sphere in her sleep. She asked what it was for. He said it was for an experiment. She shrugged and told him the price, and he paid half up front with coins he had earned hauling scrap for Dohan. She would have it ready in 2 days. While he waited, he worked on the filament. He needed something that would glow without melting and without burning. Iron melted too fast. Copper was worse. He needed carbon. Pure carbon has a melting point above 3,000 degrees. In an oxygen-free environment, a carbon filament will glow white-hot for hours. Edison had used carbonized bamboo. Hyun-woo did not have bamboo, but he had cotton thread from the rag pile in his room. He took a length of thick cotton thread and wound it into a tight coil. Then he packed it in a clay cup and sealed the top with wet clay, leaving only a tiny hole for gas to escape. He placed the sealed cup in Dohan's forge at the edge of the coals, where the heat was high but not extreme. The clay glowed dull red. Smoke curled from the tiny hole. The cotton inside was pyrolyzing. The volatile compounds were burning off and leaving behind a skeleton of pure carbon. After an hour, he pulled the cup from the coals with tongs and let it cool. He cracked the clay seal, and inside was a black, brittle coil. Carbon fiber. Crude and fragile, but carbon. He tested it by touching it to the battery terminals. A faint glow at the thinnest point. Dim, barely visible. But it lasted more than 3 seconds. It lasted almost 10 before the carbon oxidized and crumbled in the open air. 10 seconds, 3 times longer than the iron wire. And that was in open air, where the oxygen was eating it alive. In a sealed glass bulb with the oxygen removed, it would last much longer. The glass sphere arrived on schedule. Marga had done good work. The sphere was clear and even with walls thin enough to see through, and a neck just wide enough to fit 2 wire leads. Hyun-woo spent an evening preparing. He drew 2 thin copper wires through the neck of the sphere and sealed them in place with a paste made from clay and ash and a drop of the sulfuric acid mixed with calcium powder he had scraped from a limestone wall. The seal hardened overnight. Not airtight by modern standards, not even close, but it would hold for a while. He attached the carbon filament to the 2 copper leads inside the sphere. The filament hung in the center of the glass like a tiny black bridge. Now the hard part, removing the air. He could not build a vacuum pump. He did not have the materials or the precision. But he had an idea that was ugly and imperfect and might just work. He heated a piece of charcoal until it glowed and dropped it into the sphere through the neck. The charcoal consumed oxygen inside the sphere and produced carbon dioxide. He quickly sealed the neck with more clay paste. The atmosphere inside was now mostly carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Not a vacuum, not even close. But carbon dioxide does not support combustion the way oxygen does. The filament would last longer, maybe much longer. He let the seal dry for a full day. Then, on a cold evening with rain tapping against the rag-stuffed window of his room, he connected the leads to his sulfuric acid battery, all 12 cells in series. He touched the wire to the terminal and held his breath. The filament glowed, red at first, then orange. Then a steady, warm yellow-white that filled the tiny room with light. Real light, not candlelight, not firelight, electric light. The shadows in the corners retreated. The stone walls turned from black to gray. He could see the cracks in the mortar and the grain of the wooden beam above his head and the individual threads in the rag over the window. The light was steady. No flicker, no smoke, no smell of tallow or oil. Just a silent, warm glow from a glass sphere no bigger than his fist. He counted. 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes. The filament held. It was dimming slightly as the battery drained, but it held. At 3 minutes and maybe 40 seconds, the filament broke. The carbon had oxidized through despite the reduced oxygen atmosphere. The light died and the room went dark again, and the after image floated in his vision like a golden ghost. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. In a world that had never seen a second of electric light, he had produced nearly 4 minutes. He sat in the dark and his hands were trembling, and he pressed them flat against the cold dirt floor to steady them. 4 minutes was not enough for a product, but it was enough for a demonstration. The next morning, he told Doan. The old smith listened and said nothing, and then asked to see it. Hyun-woo said he needed to build a new filament and recharge the battery. The acid was nearly spent. He needed more. Doan reached into his apron and put a small leather pouch on the anvil. Coins. More than Hyun-woo had seen in his time here. He told the boy to buy what he needed. Hyun-woo went to Ordon the alchemist and bought a full jug of sulfuric acid this time. He bought more zinc scraps. He bought cotton thread of the thickest kind available. He built a new battery, 20 cells this time instead of 12. More voltage, more current, more power. He carbonized a new filament, thicker, wound tighter. He prepared a second glass sphere from marga and sealed it more carefully with double layers of clay paste and a final coat of pine resin that Do-han used for waterproofing tool handles. That evening, Do-han came to his room. The old man had to duck through the low doorway, and he filled half the space just by standing there. He looked at the battery on the floor and the wires and the glass sphere, and his expression was that of a man watching someone build either a miracle or a catastrophe. Hyun-woo connected the leads. The filament caught. The light bloomed, and Do-han's face changed. The hardness cracked. His eyes went wide and then narrow and then wide again. The light painted his scarred features in gold and shadow. And for a moment, the 50-year-old smith who had seen everything looked like a child seeing snow for the first time. The light held. 1 minute, 2, 3, 4, 5. At 6 minutes, it was still burning. Dimmer now, the battery was weakening. But the filament held. Do-han reached out his hand toward the sphere and stopped. He asked if it was hot. Hyun-woo said the glass was warm but would not burn him. Do-han touched it with one fingertip. Then he wrapped his whole hand around it and held it up and turned it slowly, and the light moved with it, and the shadows in the room swung like a compass needle finding north. He said nothing for a long time. The filament lasted 7 minutes and 12 seconds. When it finally broke and the dark returned, Do-han was still holding the sphere. He set it down gently on the stool as if it were made of gold. Then he looked at Hyun-woo and his voice was rough and quiet, and he said he had once known a man who believed the world could be different, a scholar named Un. He said Un had asked questions that the tower did not permit, about the nature of their light, about why it could not be taught, about what the mages actually did when they raised their hands. The tower sent 2 robed men to his house on a winter night. By morning, the house was empty. Un was never seen again. His books were burned. His name was struck from the guild records. Do-han said he had been Un's friend, and he had done nothing. He had stood in his forge and done nothing because he was afraid, and because he told himself that a smith had no business questioning the tower. He said that was 20 years ago, and he had thought about it every day since. He put his hand on the dead glass sphere and said, "This changes nothing yet." But the boy had shown him that Un was right. The tower's light is not a gift from the gods. It is a thing that can be built. And if it can be built, it can be understood. And if it can be understood, it was never divine. Hyun-woo nodded. He said he needed Do-han's help to build something bigger, something that would last hours, not minutes. Something bright enough to light a room, then a house, then a street. Do-han picked up his hammer out of habit and held it and looked at it. Then he said he was too old to be afraid of the tower. He asked where they should start. Hyun-woo needed a generator. Batteries were useful for testing, but they drained fast, and the acid was expensive. A generator would produce current endlessly as long as something turned the shaft. He explained the concept to Do-han, a magnet spinning inside a coil of wire. The old smith understood rotation and force, and he grasped the idea faster than Hyun-woo expected. The problem was the magnet. Lodestone was weak. A fist-sized piece of natural magnetite would barely deflect his compass needle from 2 feet away. He needed a stronger magnet. He needed an electromagnet. And to make an electromagnet, he needed current, which meant he was back to the battery. But only temporarily. He could use the battery to magnetize iron, permanent magnetization. He took a rod of hard steel from Do-han's stock and wrapped it in 50 turns of copper wire and connected the coil to his 20-cell battery for a full minute. When he disconnected the wire and brought the compass near the rod, the needle swung violently. The steel rod was now a permanent magnet, 5 times stronger than his lodestone. He made 2 of them. Then he built the generator. Do-han forged a simple iron frame from scrap, 2 uprights and a crossbar. The magnets were mounted on the crossbar, facing each other, with a gap between them. In the gap, Hyun-woo mounted a wooden spindle wrapped with 4 coils of copper wire. The spindle sat in greased wooden bearings that Do-han carved with surprising delicacy. A handle on one end allowed a person to crank the spindle by hand. When the coils spun between the magnets, they cut through the magnetic field and current flowed. Hyun-woo connected the output wires to his compass galvanometer and turned the crank. The needle went wild, swinging back and forth with each half rotation. Alternating current. He was generating real, usable electricity from muscle power alone. No acid, no zinc, no consumables. Just motion. He turned the crank faster and the needle swung wider. Slower, and it calmed. The output was proportional to speed, exactly as Faraday's law predicted. He built a new light bulb. Thicker filament, better seal, triple layer of clay paste and pine resin. He connected it to the generator and turned the crank at a steady pace. The filament caught and glowed, and the light was brighter than the battery version because the voltage was higher. And it did not fade. As long as he turned the crank, the light held steady. He cranked for 10 minutes and his arm burned, but the light never wavered. Do-han watched from his stool and said nothing, but his eyes were fixed on the glowing sphere and his hands gripped his knees. Then Hyun-woo stopped cranking and the light died. He looked at Do-han and said, "Now imagine this connected to a water wheel." Do-han's eyes moved to the window. Through it, you could hear the river that ran along the north edge of town. The river that turned the grain mill. The river that never stopped. Hyun-woo said a water wheel turns day and night. Connected to this machine, and you have light day and night. Forever. No mage, no fuel, no prayer. Just the river doing what rivers do. Do-han stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the gray sky and the rooftops and somewhere beyond them, the river. He said the grain mill was owned by a man named Grom. Hyun-woo felt something shift in the borrowed body's memory. Grom. He knew that name. A flash of feeling came with it. Shame. Hunger. The sting of a hand across the face. Grom was the merchant who had owned the apprentice before Do-han took him in. The body remembered what the mind did not. Long hours, short rations, beatings for small mistakes. Grom had used the boy until he was nearly broken and then discarded him. Hyun-woo filed the name away and returned to the problem. He did not need Grom's mill. He needed his own water source. Do-han said there was a smaller stream south of town. It fed an old mill that had been abandoned years ago when the channel silted up. The building still stood. Mostly. They went to look at it that afternoon. The old mill was a ruin of moss-covered stone and rotting timber. The water wheel was gone. The channel was choked with mud and reeds, but the stream still flowed, and the drop was good. Maybe 3 meters from the upper channel to the lower, enough head to turn a decent wheel. Hyun-woo paced the ruin and measured with his eyes and calculated in his head. A new wheel, wooden, maybe 2 meters in diameter. An overshot design to maximize torque from the available head, connected by belt or gear to the generator shaft. He would need to scale up everything. Bigger magnets, more coils, heavier wire, a proper frame. It was weeks of work, maybe a month. He told Do-han. The old man looked at the ruin, and then at the stream, and then at Hyun-woo. He said a month was optimistic. But he had nothing better to do with his remaining years than build impossible things with a boy who talked like a scholar and worked like a mule. They started the next day. Do-won handled the metalwork. Hyun-woo handled the design. They cleared the channel first. 3 days of digging mud in cold water up to their knees. Do-won complained the entire time and did not stop working for a single moment. The water wheel took a week. They salvaged timber from the old mill, and Do-won shaped the iron fittings and axle on his anvil. The wheel was rough. The buckets were uneven. But when they set it in the channel and let the water flow, it turned. Slowly at first, then steadily. A constant rotation powered by nothing but gravity and moving water. Hyun-woo watched it turn and thought about how many kilowatts of power were flowing past him in that stream, and how even this crude wheel captured maybe 2% of it, and how 2% was still more than enough to light 100 bulbs. The generator took another week. Do-han forged a heavier frame and a proper shaft that mated to the water wheel axle through a crude belt drive made from stitched leather. Hyun-woo wound the largest coils yet, 200 turns of copper wire around an iron core the size of his forearm. 4 coils mounted on the spinning armature, 4 permanent magnets fixed to the frame. When the water wheel turned, the armature spun, and the output was strong enough to make his compass needle spin in circles like a broken clock. He needed a way to convert the alternating current to direct current for his filament lamps, a commutator. He built one from a split copper ring mounted on the shaft with 2 copper brush contacts pressing against it. The brushes sparked when they made contact, tiny flashes of blue-white light at the point of connection. But the output was now pulsing direct current, rough, unfiltered, but usable. He built 5 new bulbs, better than any before. Marga had refined her technique after his 3rd order, and now produced spheres of consistent thickness with smooth necks that accepted his wire leads cleanly. He had improved his sealing method too. Clay paste, then pine resin, then a final coat of beeswax that Do-han sourced from a farmer outside town. The filaments were carbonized cotton, wound tight and thick. Each bulb lasted longer than the last. His best one burned for over an hour before the filament finally gave out. 1 hour of continuous electric light from a stream and a spinning magnet. On the evening he connected the first bulb to the water-powered generator, he invited Do-han to the mill. The old smith arrived at dusk. The stream was running strong from recent rain, and the wheel was turning at a good pace. Hyun-woo had mounted a bulb on a wooden bracket on the wall of the ruined mill. He connected the leads to the generator output, and the bulb came alive. The light filled the old stone building and spilled out through the gaps in the walls and the empty window frames. From outside, the mill looked like it had swallowed a piece of the sun. Do-han stood in the doorway, and the light made his shadow stretch long across the wet grass behind him. He said nothing for a full minute. Then, he said the boy should be careful who sees this. Hyun-woo knew he was right. But he also knew that secrecy had a limit. He could not build an industry in hiding. He needed customers. He needed money. He needed people to see what electricity could do and want it badly enough to pay for it. The next morning, a girl appeared at the forge. She was young, maybe 22, thin and sharp-featured, with ink stains on her fingers and eyes that moved too quickly. She asked for the smith's apprentice. Do-han told her the boy was in the back. She found Hyun-woo winding wire and stood watching him for a moment before speaking. She said her name was Se-rin. She said she had seen a light in the old mill last night, a light that was not fire and not magic. She had watched it from the hill above the stream for nearly 20 minutes before it went out. Hyun-woo's hands stopped moving. He asked what she wanted. She said she wanted to know how he did it. He asked why. She said because her father had spent his life trying to understand the nature of the tower's light, and the tower had destroyed him for it. Her father's name was Un. Hyun-woo felt the room tilt slightly. Un. The scholar Do-han had mentioned, the man who had asked forbidden questions and vanished on a winter night. This was his daughter. Se-rin said she had been 12 when they took her father. She remembered the sound of boots on frozen ground and the smell of smoke when they burned his papers. She said she had spent 10 years since then collecting what fragments of his work she could find. Hidden notes, pages torn from burned books, half-finished diagrams she could not understand. She pulled a folded piece of paper from inside her coat and held it out to Hyun-woo. He unfolded it. The paper was old and brittle and covered in small, careful handwriting. Diagrams of coils, sketches of metal plates in liquid, a drawing that looked unmistakably like a voltaic pile. Hyun-woo stared at it. Un had been close, incredibly close. He had intuited the relationship between metal and liquid and some kind of invisible force. He had drawn diagrams that were crude but recognizable versions of galvanic cells and induction coils. He had been working toward the same discoveries that Hyun-woo carried in his head. And the tower had killed him for it. Se-rin watched Hyun-woo's face as he read, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. She asked if he understood the diagrams. He said yes. She asked if her father had been right. He said yes. Her father had been right about almost everything. He had been missing a few pieces, but the foundation was sound. Se-rin's hands clenched at her sides. She did not cry. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady. She said she wanted to learn. Everything, whatever Hyun-woo knew. She said she could read and write and calculate. She said she learned fast. She said she was not afraid of the tower. Hyun-woo looked at this thin girl with ink on her fingers and her dead father's research in her coat, and he thought about what it meant to teach. Not just to build, to teach, to make the knowledge survive beyond one person. He said yes. Se-rin became his first student. She arrived at the forge every morning before dawn and stayed until dark. Do-han grumbled about feeding another mouth, but he never turned her away. Hyun-woo taught her in the order that made sense, not the order of history, the order of logic. First, he taught her about charge, that all matter contains two kinds of invisible force, that like repels like, and opposites attract. She grasped it in minutes. Then, current, the flow of charge through a conductor. She asked what a conductor was. He said any material that allows charge to move through it easily. Copper, iron, water with salt dissolved in it. She asked why some materials conduct and others do not. He paused. That question led to atomic theory and quantum mechanics, and he was not ready to go there. He said the answer was deep, and they would return to it later. She accepted this with a nod that told him she would not forget to ask again. Within a week, she understood Ohm's law. Voltage equals current times resistance. She understood that a battery creates voltage. That wire has resistance. That thinner wire has more resistance and heats up faster, which is why filaments glow. She understood series and parallel circuits. She could calculate how many cells were needed to produce a given brightness. She was faster than any student he had taught during his brief stint as a teaching assistant at university. And she had no formal education at all. What she had was 10 years of staring at her father's forbidden notes and trying to decode them, alone in the dark. Hyun-woo revised the notes with her. He corrected Yoon's errors and filled in the gaps. Where Yoon had drawn a voltaic pile without understanding the chemistry, Hyun-woo explained the reaction. Zinc dissolves in acid and releases electrons. The electrons flow through the external circuit to the copper. At the copper, they combine with hydrogen ions in the acid, and hydrogen gas bubbles off. That is why the battery weakens over time. The zinc is consumed. It is not magic. It is chemistry. Se-rin wrote everything down in a small leather-bound book she carried inside her coat. She wrote fast and small, and she never asked him to repeat himself. One evening, after a long day of winding coils and testing circuits, she asked Hyun-woo where he had learned all of this. He had prepared for this question. He told her he had studied under a foreign master in a distant land, a land where these principles were known but kept secret by a different kind of tower. He said his master had died and left him with the knowledge and the obligation to spread it. It was not entirely a lie. His university professors were dead to him in every meaningful sense, and the obligation was real. Se-rin looked at him for a long time. She said she did not believe him, but she did not need to. The knowledge was real, and that was enough. Meanwhile, the mill had become a workshop. Doan built a proper workbench from salvaged timber. Hyun-woo organized his materials: copper wire on wooden spools, zinc and copper plates stored dry, acid in sealed clay jugs, carbon filaments in a box lined with cloth, glass spheres from marga stacked carefully in straw. He had enough components to build 20 bulbs. The generator ran day and night, powered by the stream. He added a second belt to improve the power transfer, and the output increased by a third. He built a voltage divider from coils of iron wire, so he could run multiple bulbs from one generator without burning them out. 3 bulbs on the wall of the mill, then 5. The old ruin glowed at night like a lantern, and Hyun-woo knew it was only a matter of time before someone other than Se-rin noticed. The someone came on a Tuesday. A merchant's wagon pulled up outside the mill at midday. The driver was a thick-necked man with a red face and small, shrewd eyes. He introduced himself as a representative of the trade guild and said he had heard rumors about lights in the old mill. He asked to see. Hyun-woo showed him. He lit 3 bulbs and the merchant stared, and then he asked how much. Hyun-woo had not expected the question so directly. He named a price that was probably too low. The merchant did not haggle. He said he wanted 10 bulbs installed in his warehouse by the end of the month. He put a bag of silver on the workbench and left. Hyun-woo stared at the silver. Then he looked at Do-han, who was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Do-han said the boy had just undersold himself by half, but it was a start. That night, Hyun-woo lay on his straw pallet in the room above the forge, and he could not sleep. He counted the problems. He could not install bulbs in a warehouse across town without running wire from the mill generator. The distance was maybe 400 meters. Copper wire that long would have significant resistance. The voltage would drop. The bulbs would be dim or dead by the time the current reached them. He needed thicker wire, much thicker, or higher voltage at the source, or a second generator at the warehouse, or all 3. He needed infrastructure. He needed a grid. The word made him almost laugh. A power grid in a medieval town, run by one engineer and an old smith and a girl with ink on her fingers. He closed his eyes and started designing it in his head. Main line from the mill, thick copper, elevated on wooden poles to keep it off the ground and away from rain and animals. Step up the voltage at the source and step down at the destination. Transformers. He would need transformers. Coils of wire around iron cores, the same principle as the generator but in reverse. Higher voltage means lower current for the same power, which means less loss over distance. This was how power grids worked in his world. This was how Edison and Westinghouse had electrified cities. And he was going to do it with hand-drawn wire and hand-forged iron in a town that still used candles. He built the first transformer in 3 days. 2 coils of copper wire wound around a shared iron core. The primary coil had 50 turns. The secondary had 200. When he fed the generator's output into the primary, the secondary produced 4 times the voltage, enough to push current through 400 meters of wire and still have power left to light a bulb at the other end. Do-han forged iron brackets, and Hyun-woo designed simple wooden poles. They started with the direct route from the mill to the merchant's warehouse. 12 poles, each one a stripped pine trunk, sunk into the ground and braced with stones. The copper wire ran along the tops, held in place by notches cut into the wood. It looked crude. It looked like something a child might build from sticks and string. But when Hyun-woo connected the transformer at the mill end and a step-down transformer at the warehouse end and wired in 10 bulbs along the warehouse ceiling, the merchant struck a flint to check whether the lamps were burning, and then stopped because he did not need the flint. The warehouse was bright, evenly lit from end to end. No smoke, no oil smell, no fire risk near his stored grain and cloth. The merchant walked the length of his warehouse twice, and then he shook Hyun-woo's hand and said he would tell everyone he knew. Hyun-woo asked him not to mention exactly how it worked. The merchant laughed and said he did not understand how it worked, so that would be easy. Word spread anyway. Within a week, 3 more merchants came to the mill asking for lights. A baker wanted his ovens illuminated for the early morning shifts. A tavern owner wanted something to replace the tallow candles that dripped grease on his customers. An old woman who ran a weaving shop said her girls were going blind working by candlelight, and she would pay whatever he asked for something brighter. Hyun-woo took every order. He calculated loads and distances and wire gauges in his head and on scraps of paper. He taught Se-rin to wind transformers. She learned in 1 afternoon, and her coils were neater than his own. Do-han forged more brackets and poles and grumbled about the copper cost, and then sourced more copper from a trader in Valcour without being asked. The grid grew. 1 line became 3. 3 became 7. The poles marched through the streets of the town like a line of wooden soldiers, and the wires hummed faintly in the wind, and people stopped to stare at them and point and whisper. The money came in. Not a flood, but a steady stream. Silver coins that Hyun-woo counted each evening and divided into 3 piles. 1 for materials, 1 for Do-han, 1 for savings. He paid Se-rin too, though she refused twice before accepting. He told her that knowledge has value and labor has value, and she provided both. She took the coins and bought more paper and ink. She was writing everything down, not just circuits and formulas. She was writing instructions, how to build a battery, how to wind a coil, how to carbonize a filament, how to seal a bulb. Step by step, in clear, simple language that anyone who could read would understand. Hyun-woo looked at her pages one evening and realized she was writing a textbook, the first electrical engineering textbook in the history of this world. He told her it was the most important thing she could do, more important than any single bulb or wire. She looked at him and said her father would have said the same thing. It was on the 9th day of the grid expansion that the trouble came. Hyun-woo was up a pole adjusting a wire connection when he saw 2 figures in blue robes walking down the street toward the mill. They moved slowly, and the crowd parted around them the way water parts around stones. Tower mages. He climbed down fast and found Do-han already watching from the forge doorway. The old smith's face was set like iron. The 2 mages did not come to the mill. They walked the length of the street, looking at the poles and the wires. One of them reached up and touched a wire with his bare hand. Nothing happened because the line was dead at that moment. The generator was shut down for maintenance. The mage examined his fingers and then looked at his companion, and they exchanged words that Hyun-woo could not hear. Then they left. Do-han spat on the ground and said that was a scouting party. Hyun-woo asked how he knew. Do-han said he had seen the same thing 20 years ago. Two men in blue walking slowly through the streets, looking at things, touching things, not speaking to anyone. A week later, they came for Un. Se-rin was inside the mill and had not seen the mages. Hyun-woo chose not to tell her. Not yet. He needed time to think. That night, he sat in the mill with the generator humming and the 5 test bulbs glowing on the wall, and he thought about what the tower would do. They would investigate first, quietly. They would ask questions. Who was this boy? Where did he learn? What was his claim? Was he using magic without sanction? Was he a heretic? They would gather information and then they would act. He had weeks, maybe less. He needed to be ready. He needed allies beyond Do-han and Se-rin. He needed someone with power, someone the tower could not simply erase in the night. He thought about the merchant who had been his first customer. The man had connections, money, influence in the trade guild. But guild influence meant nothing against the tower. He needed someone higher, much higher. He needed the court. He needed the crown. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. One of Hyun-woo's merchant customers was a cloth trader named Bellick, who supplied fabrics to the noble houses of the capital. Bellick had been so impressed by the electric lights in his warehouse that he mentioned them to a contact at court. That contact told someone else, and that someone else told Prince Caden. A letter arrived at the mill carried by a rider in a gray cloak bearing no insignia. The letter was short and unsigned. It said that a certain person of influence wished to see a demonstration of the lights that burned without fire or magic. The demonstration would take place at a manor house 2 days' ride south of town. Hyun-woo was to come alone and bring his devices and tell no one. Do-han read the letter and said it was a trap. Se-rin read the letter and said it was a trap. Hyun-woo agreed it was probably a trap. He went anyway. He packed a battery of 30 cells, 2 bulbs, a small hand-crank generator, a coil of wire, tools. He wrapped everything in cloth and loaded it onto a borrowed mule and rode south for 2 days through rain that never quite stopped. The manor house was gray stone, surrounded by a low wall and bare winter trees. Guards at the gate searched him and his packs without speaking. They let him keep the equipment after examining it and finding nothing they recognized as a weapon. He was led to a room on the upper floor. Stone walls, heavy curtains, a fire burning in a hearth that was bigger than his room at the forge. A man sat in a chair by the fire. He was younger than Hyun-woo expected, maybe 28, dark hair cut short, a face that was handsome in the way that faces are when they have never known hunger or hard labor. But the eyes were sharp and restless, and they fixed on Hyun-woo with an intensity that felt physical. The man did not introduce himself. He asked Hyun-woo to show him what he had brought. Hyun-woo sat up on a table near the window. He connected the battery to a bulb, and it lit. The man leaned forward slightly. Hyun-woo disconnected the battery and connected the hand-crank generator. He turned the crank, and the bulb glowed brighter than before. The man stood up and walked to the table and looked at the spinning device and the glowing sphere and the copper wires connecting them. He asked how it worked. Hyun-woo gave him the simplest explanation he could. Spinning metal near metal creates an invisible force that flows through copper like water through a pipe. The force heats a thin thread inside the glass, and the thread glows. The man asked if it was magic. Hyun-woo said no. The man asked if Hyun-woo was a mage. Hyun-woo said no. The man asked if anyone could learn to build these things. Hyun-woo said yes. Anyone with hands and patience and access to copper and iron. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said his name was Caden, fourth son of King Aldrin of Arkin. He said he had heard of the tower's interest in a certain smith's apprentice in a northern town. He said the tower had already sent a formal inquiry to the local magistrate requesting information about unlicensed production of light. Hyun-woo felt the cold settle into his stomach. Formal inquiry. That was fast. Caden continued. He said the tower had 3 options. Declare Hyun-woo a heretic and destroy him openly. Declare him a rogue mage and absorb him into the tower under their control. Or declare his devices fraudulent and ban them. All 3 options ended with Hyun-woo losing everything, unless he had protection. Hyun-woo asked what kind of protection. Caden smiled for the first time, and it was not a warm smile. He said royal patronage. A decree from the crown declaring Hyun-woo's work legitimate and placing him under the protection of the throne. In exchange, Caden wanted exclusive access to the technology for 1 year. He wanted electric light in the royal palace before any noble house. He wanted military applications. He wanted to be the prince who brought a new age to Arkin. And he wanted the tower humiliated because the tower had supported his elder brother's claim to succession, and Caden had a long memory. Hyun-woo looked at this prince with his sharp eyes and his calculated smile, and he understood exactly what he was dealing with. Caden did not care about light for the common people. He did not care about knowledge or freedom or progress. He cared about power. He wanted to use electricity the same way the tower used magic, as leverage, as a weapon, as a tool of control. But right now, standing in this gray stone room with the tower already moving against him, Hyun-woo needed Caden more than Caden needed him. He accepted. Caden produced a document already written and sealed, royal patronage, signed by Caden in his capacity as Prince of the Blood with authority over the northern provinces. It was not a king's decree. It was not unbreakable, but it was enough to slow the tower's hand, enough to buy time. Hyun-woo rode back north with the document in his coat and the taste of compromise in his mouth. He had just made a deal with a man who saw people as instruments, but he was alive and he was protected, and the tower would have to go through a prince to reach him. For now, that was enough. Hyun-woo returned to find the town changed. The wire poles still stood, but someone had cut 2 of the lines during the night. Clean cuts. Deliberate. Do-han met him at the forge with a face like a closed fist. He said a man in blue robes had visited the magistrate yesterday. The magistrate had posted a notice in the market square declaring that all unlicensed light production was under review by the tower, pending investigation of possible heresy. 3 of Hyun-woo's merchant customers had sent word canceling their orders. The baker had pulled the bulbs from his ceiling and returned them in a sack. Only the old weaving woman had kept her lights burning. She told the magistrate's clerk that her girls needed to see, and the tower could come explain to them personally why they should go blind. Hyun-woo showed Do-han the patronage document. The old smith read it slowly, moving his lips, and then read it again. He said a prince's seal was not a king's seal. Hyun-woo said it was better than nothing. Do-han said barely. But his shoulders loosened half an inch, and that was as much relief as the old man ever showed. Hyun-woo sent a copy of the document to the magistrate through Belik, the cloth trader. The magistrate read it and did nothing further. The notice stayed in the square, but no one came to tear down the poles or arrest Hyun-woo. The tower's hand had been slowed, not stopped. Se-rin had not been idle during his absence. She had finished 12 chapters of her textbook, and she had recruited help, 3 young men from the town. A carpenter's son named Tal, who was good with his hands. A former scribe's apprentice named Yun, who could copy diagrams with perfect precision. and a tanner's boy named Kem, who was strong and willing and asked no questions. Se-rin had taught them basic circuits while Hyun-woo was gone. Tal could already wire a bulb. Yoon could wind a transformer coil that met specification. They were not engineers, but they were the beginning of a workforce. Hyun-woo looked at Se-rin's neat pages and her 3 students, and he felt something shift inside his chest. This was no longer one man with a secret. This was a school. He repaired the cut lines. He installed thicker wire on the main trunk from the mill. He added a second generator to the water wheel shaft, doubling the output. Do-han built a proper switchboard from iron and copper, where Hyun-woo could connect and disconnect individual lines without shutting down the whole grid. The town hummed. Not loudly, not everywhere, but in the streets where the wires ran, you could hear it. A faint singing of copper in wind and current. People looked up at the wires the way they once looked up at the tower's spires, with wonder and a little fear. Caden sent his first demand 3 weeks after their meeting. He wanted a demonstration at the royal court. Not a private showing, a full display before the king and the assembled nobles and the tower representatives. He wanted Hyun-woo to light a room in the palace, brighter than any mage had ever managed. The letter was polite, but the meaning was clear. Kaiden was calling in his investment. Hyun-woo had 6 weeks to prepare. He needed portable generators. Batteries were too weak for a palace-sized room. He needed at least 50 bulbs of reliable quality. He needed wire and transformers and a mounting system that looked presentable in a royal hall. And he needed it all to work perfectly, because one failure in front of the king would be the end. He worked 18 hours a day. Se-rin worked beside him. Do-han forged components until his hammer arms swelled, and he had to wrap it in cold cloth at night. Tal and Yoon and Kem ran errands and wound coils and tested bulbs and learned more in 6 weeks than most apprentices learn in a year. Marga the glassblower hired an assistant to keep up with the bulb orders. By the 5th week, they had 42 working bulbs, 3 portable generators driven by hand cranks, 200 meters of insulated wire, 8 transformers, and a plan. Se-rin had drawn the wiring diagram for the palace demonstration. It was elegant. 2 generators feeding a main bus with transformers stepping up for the trunk line and stepping down for each cluster of bulbs. Redundancy built in, so that if one generator failed, the other could carry the load at reduced brightness. Hyun-woo looked at her diagram and told her it was better than anything he could have drawn. She said she had a good teacher. He said she had surpassed her teacher, and he meant it. The capital was 3 days south by wagon. They loaded everything carefully. Generators in straw, bulbs in wooden crates lined with cloth, wire coiled and labeled, tools in leather rolls. Do-han drove the wagon and complained about the roads and the weather and the food at every inn, and Hyun-woo found the sound of it comforting. Se-rin rode beside the wagon on a borrowed horse and read her notes and quizzed herself on transformer ratios. The capital was larger than Hyun-woo expected. Stone walls 30 feet high, a gatehouse with iron doors, streets paved with flat stones, worn smooth by centuries of feet and hooves and wheels. The buildings were 3 and 4 stories tall, and the tower of the Archimages rose above them all. White stone, narrow windows, a spire that caught the last light of the setting sun and held it like a blade. Hyun-woo looked at it and felt the weight of what he was about to do. Caden met them at a side entrance to the palace. He was dressed simply and accompanied by only 2 guards. He led them through corridors of polished stone to a great hall with a vaulted ceiling and tall windows draped in heavy cloth. This was where the demonstration would take place, tomorrow evening, before the king, before the court, before representatives of the tower. Hyun-woo surveyed the room. It was vast, maybe 40 meters long and 15 wide. The ceiling was at least 10 meters high. Pillars of gray stone lined both sides. At the far end, a raised platform held 2 chairs. The larger one was the throne. To light this space, he would need every bulb he had. He and his team worked through the night. They mounted bulbs along the pillars at 3-meter intervals, 20 bulbs on each side, 2 clusters of 5 above the platform. The generators were set up in an anteroom behind the hall, connected by heavy copper cables run through holes Do-han drilled in the stone wall. 2 generators, 4 men to crank them. Kaden had provided the men, soldiers with strong arms and no curiosity about what they were turning. The wiring ran along the base of the pillars, hidden by cloth draping that Se-rin arranged. The transformers sat behind the pillars, out of sight. By dawn, everything was in place. Hyun-woo tested each circuit. 3 bulbs had failed overnight. He replaced them with spares. He tested the generators at full speed. The hall erupted in light, and even knowing what to expect, he caught his breath. 50 bulbs blazing in a stone hall built for candlelight. Every surface was visible, every carving on the pillars, every thread in the tapestries. The dust motes in the air turned to floating gold. He shut everything down, and they waited. The evening came slowly. Hyun-woo spent the afternoon checking connections for the 4th time. Se-rin sat in a corner and did not speak. Do-han sharpened a knife he had brought from the forge. He said it was for cutting wire, but the way he held it suggested other uses. The court assembled after sunset. Hyun-woo watched from behind a curtain as they entered. Lords and ladies in silk and velvet, military officers in polished armor, merchants in fine wool. And at the edges of the room, 4 figures in deep blue robes with silver embroidery. Tower mages. One of them was older than the others. Tall and thin, with white hair and a face like carved marble. He moved with the certainty of a man who had never been questioned in his life. Hyun-woo did not know his name yet, but he knew who this was. The highest-ranking mage they had sent. Maybe the highest in the tower. The king entered last. A heavy man with a gray beard and tired eyes. He sat on the throne and the room went silent. Kaden stood beside the throne and spoke. He said he had brought something new to the court, a marvel that would change the kingdom. He gestured and servants extinguished every candle and every lamp in the hall. The room went dark, completely dark. The windows were draped, the doors were shut. 300 people stood in blackness, and the silence was total. Kaden gave the signal. In the anteroom, the soldiers began to crank. Hyun-woo connected the main switch. The bulbs came alive. Not all at once. He had designed the circuit to cascade. The 2 bulbs nearest the entrance first, then the next pair, then the next. A wave of light rolling down the hall like sunrise compressed into seconds. Pair by pair, the pillars blazed to life, and the darkness peeled back, and the faces of the court emerged from shadow. Eyes wide, mouths open, hands gripping each other. The light reached the platform, and the final 10 bulbs above the throne ignited, and the king sat bathed in electric radiance brighter than any noon sun that had ever entered this hall. The gasps were audible. Someone dropped a goblet. A woman made a sound that might have been a prayer. The king gripped the arms of his throne and stared upward at the glowing spheres, and his tired eyes were not tired anymore. The old mage in blue stood perfectly still. His face showed nothing. But his hands were clasped behind his back, and Hyun-woo could see from his angle that the fingers were white with pressure. The silence lasted 7 seconds. Then the hall exploded into noise. Lords talking over each other, ladies pointing at the bulbs, officers craning their necks. The king raised his hand and the room quieted, and he asked who had made this. Kaden led Hyun-woo forward. Hyun-woo bowed. The king looked at him and asked if he was a mage. Hyun-woo said no. The king asked if this was magic. Hyun-woo said no. It was a force of nature, harnessed through metal and motion. Anyone could learn to do it. The king asked Anyone. Hyun-woo said yes. A farmer, a smith, a child. The knowledge required nothing but teaching. The old mage stepped forward. His name was Velazar. Hyun-woo heard it whispered through the crowd, and the name carried weight like a stone dropped into still water. Velazar's voice was calm and measured, and carried to every corner of the hall without effort. He said the boy was either a hidden mage who had not reported to the tower as law required, or a practitioner of forbidden arts. In either case, he was in violation of the Covenant of Light, which reserved all production of illumination beyond fire to sanctioned members of the tower. He said the demonstration was impressive, but unsanctioned and potentially heretical, and he requested the king's permission to examine the devices and the boy who made them. The king looked at Velazar, then at Hyun-woo, then at Caden. Caden spoke before the king could answer. He said the boy operated under royal patronage and was therefore exempt from tower examination without crown consent. Velazar turned to Caden, and his expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. He said royal patronage did not supersede the Covenant of Light, which predated the current dynasty by 400 years. Caden said the Covenant granted the tower authority over magic. These devices were not magic. Therefore, the Covenant did not apply. The hall was silent again. Every eye moved between the prince and the archmage like spectators at a duel. Velazar smiled. It was a thin, precise smile that did not reach his eyes. He said if the devices were not magic, then they were a threat to the natural order established by the gods who granted the tower its sacred duty. He said light without the divine gift was an abomination. He said the boy should be grateful the tower sought examination rather than immediate judgment. The king raised his hand again. He said he would decide. Not tonight. He would consider the matter and render judgment in 1 week. Until then, the boy and his devices were under the protection of the crown. No one would touch either. He looked at Velazar when he said this, and the archmage bowed his head a fraction. The crowd began to disperse. Hyun-woo stood by the wall and watched them go, and his heart was hammering. 1 week. He had 1 week before the king decided whether he lived or burned. Caden found him in the anteroom. The prince was flushed with something that might have been excitement or triumph or both. He said the demonstration was perfect. He said the king was impressed. He said Velazar was furious, which was even better. Hyun-woo asked what happened in a week. Caden said the king would rule in their favor if they gave him a reason to. The reason was simple: power. Not electrical power, political power. If Hyun-woo could show the king that electricity gave the crown an advantage that magic could not, then the king would choose electricity over the tower. Hyun-woo asked what kind of advantage. Caden said communication. The king's greatest weakness was the speed of information. A message from the northern border took 2 weeks by rider. A rebellion could start and end before the king even knew it had begun. The tower provided magical communication through their own channels, but this gave the tower control over what the king knew and when he knew it. If Hyun-woo could offer the king instant communication that bypassed the tower entirely, the crown would protect him forever. A telegraph. Hyun-woo almost laughed. The simplest practical application of electricity, and it was the one that would save his life. He told Caden he could build it in 3 days. Caden said he had 5. They worked in a room Caden provided inside the palace. Hyun-woo built 2 telegraph units. Simple. A battery, a switch, an electromagnet that clicked when current flowed. A code. He did not use Morse code. He invented a new one based on the local alphabet, short clicks and long clicks. He taught Se-rin to operate one unit, and he operated the other. They ran wire through the palace corridors, connecting 2 rooms on opposite ends of the building. On the 4th day, he demonstrated for the king. Hyun-woo sat in one room. Se-rin sat in another, 200 meters away, separated by stone walls and locked doors. The king stood with Hyun-woo. Kaden stood with Se-rin. The king spoke a sentence. Hyun-woo tapped it out. 30 seconds later, a messenger brought Se-rin's decoded response. The exact sentence repeated back. The king spoke another. Same result. A third time with a longer message. Perfect transmission. The king stared at the little clicking device, and Hyun-woo could see the calculation happening behind his tired eyes. Instant communication with any point in his kingdom. Without the tower. Without riders. Without waiting. The king asked how far this could reach. Hyun-woo said, as far as you can run a wire. Across a city. Across a province. Across the kingdom. The king nodded slowly. Then he asked Hyun-woo what he wanted. Hyun-woo said he wanted permission to continue his work, to teach others, to build and install his devices freely without interference from the tower. The king said that was a great deal to ask. Hyun-woo said the alternative was to leave the crown dependent on the tower for communication forever. The king looked at him for a long moment. Then he said judgment would come tomorrow. The judgment came at noon. The king declared that Hyun-woo's devices were not magic, and therefore not subject to the Covenant of Light. He placed Hyun-woo under full royal patronage, with the right to build and teach and install his devices throughout the kingdom. He appointed Kaden as overseer of what he called the new works. The tower was forbidden from interfering. Velazar stood in the throne room and heard the judgment, and his face was stone. He bowed to the king and left without speaking. But Hyun-woo watched his eyes, and what he saw there was not defeat. It was patience, the kind of patience that precedes violence. 3 months passed. They were the busiest months of Hyun-woo's life. He moved his operation to the capital. Do-han came reluctantly, leaving the forge in Tao's care. Se-rin brought her textbook and her students. Kaden provided a workshop near the palace, and funding that made the merchant's silver look like pocket change. Hyun-woo built. He built generators powered by horse-driven wheels in the palace basement. He wired the throne room and the king's chambers and the military command center. He installed telegraph lines connecting the palace to the city gates and then to relay stations along the northern road. Within 2 months, the king could send a message to the northern border garrison and receive a reply within hours instead of weeks. The military advantage was immediate and obvious. The king smiled more. Kaden smiled more. The tower said nothing. That silence worried Hyun-woo more than any threat. He expanded beyond the palace. He wired the merchant quarter, the guild halls, the main market. Streetlights appeared on the central avenue, 50 bulbs on iron poles that turned night into twilight. People gathered to stare at them. Children ran beneath them laughing. Old women sat on benches in the electric glow and knitted and talked as if it were midday. Se-rin opened a school. Not officially. Officially, it was a workshop, but inside, she taught 20 students the principles of electricity. She used her textbook. She built training circuits on wooden boards. She taught them to read diagrams and calculate resistance and wind coils and solder connections. Some of her students were women. Some were former servants. One was a boy of 14 who had been sweeping floors in the palace kitchens until he wandered into the workshop and asked what the humming sound was. Within 6 weeks, he could build a telegraph from memory. Hyun-woo watched the school grow, and he felt the thing he had been working toward from the beginning. Not just light, not just power, replication. The knowledge was spreading beyond him, beyond Se-rin, into hands and minds he had never met. If the tower destroyed him tomorrow, the knowledge would survive. It was already too late to contain it. That was the weapon. Not the generator, not the bulb. The textbook. The school. The 20 students who would each teach 20 more. Velazar struck on a night in late autumn. Hyun-woo should have expected it. The tower had been too quiet for too long. The attack came not against Hyun-woo, but against the infrastructure. In a single night, teams of tower agents cut telegraph lines in 7 locations. They smashed generators at 2 relay stations. They set fire to a warehouse storing copper wire and bulb components. And they delivered a message to the king. The message said the tower had evidence that Hyun-woo's devices were powered by stolen magical energy siphoned from the tower's own reserves. It said this theft endangered the tower's ability to fulfill its sacred covenant. It demanded Hyun-woo's immediate arrest and the destruction of all his devices. The king summoned Hyun-woo at dawn. He looked angry, but also afraid. The tower had never openly defied the crown before. This was something new, something dangerous. Hyun-woo asked for 3 days. The king gave him 2. He spent those 2 days doing something he had been preparing for since the moment he first saw the tower's white spire. He had always known this confrontation was coming. He had always known that words and demonstrations and political maneuvering would not be enough. The tower would not surrender its 1,000-year monopoly because a king told it to. The tower would only stop when it was exposed, when the lie at the foundation of its power was dragged into the light. Se-rin had found the clue months ago, in her father's notes, a diagram that did not match anything Hyun-woo had taught her. A coil wrapped around a crystal, with annotations in a hand she did not recognize, older than her father's writing, much older. She had found it pressed between 2 pages of a book she had rescued from the burning of Eun's library. The diagram showed a device that converted mechanical vibration into what Eun had labeled invisible light. Not visible illumination, something else. Something that resonated with certain crystals and produced effects that looked like magic. Hyun-woo had studied the diagram for weeks. The crystal was piezoelectric. It produced voltage when squeezed or vibrated. The invisible light was electromagnetic radiation, radio waves, or something close to them. The tower's magic was not supernatural. It was technology. Ancient technology based on principles the tower had monopolized and mystified for 1,000 years. The crystals were the key. Every mage carried one. They called them God sparks, sacred objects granted by divine will at the moment of a mage's awakening. In reality, they were piezoelectric transducers. When a mage performed the ritual gestures, they were not channeling divine energy. They were mechanically stressing the crystal in specific patterns that produced electromagnetic fields. The fields interacted with specially treated materials in the tower's lamps and devices to produce light and heat and force. It was engineering. Brilliant ancient engineering wrapped in ritual and secrecy and enforced by fear. And the tower knew. They had always known. Hyun-woo stood before the king on the morning of the 2nd day. The throne room was full. Nobles and officers and merchants who had grown used to electric light and did not want to lose it. Tower mages lined the east wall. Velazar stood at their center, composed, certain. He had come to watch the heretic fall. The king asked Hyun-woo to answer the tower's accusation. Hyun-woo said he would do more than answer it. He said he would prove that the accusation was impossible, because the tower's magic and his electricity were the same thing. The room went still. Velazar's eyes narrowed by a fraction. Hyun-woo had prepared a table at the center of the hall. On it sat a generator, a battery, a bulb, a coil of wire, and a crystal. He had obtained the crystal from Se-rin's collection of her father's materials. It was small and milky white and unremarkable to look at. But when he connected it to his galvanometer and tapped it with a small hammer, the compass needle jumped. He held it up so the court could see. He said, "This crystal produces electricity when struck. It is a natural property of the material. No gods, no gift, no magic, just pressure and atomic structure." He connected the crystal to a circuit with a specially wound coil and struck it rhythmically. The coil emitted a faint hum. He held a second crystal near the coil. The second crystal vibrated. He placed a thin glass tube coated with phosphorescent powder near the second crystal. The tube glowed. Faintly, but it glowed. The same glow as a mage's light. The exact same color. The exact same quality. He turned to Velazar and said, "This is what you do." He said every mage carries a crystal you call a god spark. When you perform your rituals, you stress the crystal in patterns that produce invisible waves. Those waves interact with treated materials and produce light and heat and force. It is not divine, it is not a gift, it is a machine. A machine your ancestors built 1,000 years ago and then hid behind ritual and mysticism so no one else could use it. Velazar's composure cracked. Not much. A tightening of the jaw, a flicker in the eyes. He said the boy was speaking blasphemy. He said the god sparks were sacred and could not be replicated by crude metal toys. He said the tower's power came from the gods, and the gods would not be mocked. Hyun-woo said, "Then show me." He held out a god spark crystal to Velazar. He said, "Show the king your divine power. And then I will show him the same power from a copper coil." Velazar did not move. The silence stretched. Then Hyun-woo connected his generator to the phosphorescent tube through the crystal circuit. He turned the crank. The tube blazed with light. Bright, white, clean. The same light the tower had been selling as divine miracle for 10 centuries. He turned the crank faster and the light grew brighter. Brighter than any mage had ever produced in this hall. He spoke while cranking. He said the tower did not discover magic. It discovered science. A previous civilization understood these principles and built devices based on them. When that civilization fell, a small group preserved the knowledge and sealed it away. They wrapped it in religion. They called it divine gift. They made themselves priests of a false miracle, and they ruled for 1,000 years by keeping the world ignorant. Every child told they lacked the gift. Every scholar burned for asking questions. Every generation raised in darkness so that a few could stand in light and call themselves gods. He stopped cranking. The tube dimmed and went dark. The hall was silent. Velazar stood like a statue. Then something happened that Hyun-woo had not expected. One of the younger mages on the east wall reached into his robe and pulled out his god spark. He held it up. His hand was shaking. He looked at it, and then at Hyun-woo's crystal on the table, and his face was the face of a man whose world was collapsing. He said he had always wondered. He said the rituals never made sense to him. He said he had asked Velazar once why the gestures had to be so precise if the power came from the gods, and Velazar had told him to stop asking or lose his place in the tower. The young mage set his crystal on the floor. Then he walked across the hall and stood beside Hyun-woo. A second mage followed. Then a third. Velazar watched them go, and his face was no longer stone. It was fury, pure and white and shaking. He raised his hands in the ritual gesture, and his own god spark blazed with light. Brighter than Hyun-woo's tube, brighter than anything in the room. The hall filled with blinding radiance, and the heat of it pushed against Hyun-woo's skin like an open furnace. Velazar's voice cut through the light. He said this was the power of the gods. He said no crystal and copper toy could match it. He said the boy would burn. Hyun-woo did not step back. He reached under the table and pulled the main switch he had installed the night before. The switch connected to the palace generators in the basement. Every bulb in the throne room ignited. Every bulb in the corridor. Every street light on the central avenue. The entire palace and the streets surrounding it erupted in electric light. Hundreds of bulbs blazing in unison. The light poured through the windows of the throne room and mixed with Velazar's magical radiance and matched it and then surpassed it, because Velazar was one man straining with everything he had, And Hyun-woo's light was a system built by dozens of hands powered by water that would never stop flowing. Velazar's light flickered. His hands trembled. Sweat ran down his face. He was pouring everything into maintaining his display, and it was not enough. It would never be enough. Because he was one, and the grid was everyone. The Archmage's light died. Velazar dropped his hands and stood gasping. His god spark fell from his fingers and hit the stone floor with a sound like a bell. The electric bulbs kept burning. Steady, silent, tireless. The king stood up from his throne. He looked at Velazar, and then at the bulbs, and then at Hyun-woo and the three mages standing beside him. He asked Hyun-woo what he wanted done. Hyun-woo said he wanted the tower's archives opened. Every text, every diagram, every record of the original science they had hidden. He wanted it all made public. He wanted a school where anyone could learn, not just the gifted, not just the chosen, anyone. He said the age of secret knowledge was over. The king looked at Velazar. The Archmage was staring at his godspark on the floor. His face was empty. Not defeated, emptied. As if something that had lived inside him for 60 years had simply left. The king gave the order. The tower's archives were to be opened under royal supervision. The Covenant of Light was suspended pending review. The tower would submit to examination of its practices and its history. Any mage who wished to leave the tower was free to do so. Any mage who wished to stay and teach openly was welcome. 3 months later, Hyun-woo stood on the roof of Se-rin's school and looked out over the capital at night. The streetlights glowed in long lines, like strings of earthbound stars. The palace blazed. The merchant quarter hummed with generators. Telegraph wires connected the city to 12 relay stations that stretched to every border of the kingdom. In the school below him, 40 students bent over workbenches, learning to build the future with their own hands. Se-rin was among them, teaching, always teaching. Dohan sat in the workshop, sharpening tools and testing wire gauges, and telling the younger students that their coils were sloppy, which was his way of saying he was proud. Hyun-woo thought about a man named Yoon, who had asked the right questions and died for them. He thought about a boy whose body he wore, who had been beaten and starved and discarded by a merchant named Grom. He thought about a world that had been kept in darkness for 1,000 years by men who called themselves gods. The darkness was ending. Not all at once, not everywhere. The tower still stood. Velazar had retreated into it with his loyalists. The archives were only partially opened. There would be resistance for years, maybe decades. But the light was out. It was in the streets and the schools and the hands of people who would never kneel again. A machine just needs a manual. And the manual was written. Se-rin had seen to that. Hyun-woo looked up at the sky. No contrails, no satellites, no glow of soul on the horizon. Just stars. Ancient and indifferent, and burning by the same physics that powered his bulbs and his generators and the whole improbable revolution he had started with scrap copper and vinegar in a room with a dirt floor. He was home. Not the home he had lost, but the one he had built. And it was bright. The tower did not fall quietly. Velazar sealed the gates on the 3rd day after the king's decree. Iron doors 20 feet tall shut with a sound that echoed across the capital like a tomb closing. 46 mages remained inside with him, the loyalists, the ones who had spent their lives believing they were chosen by the gods and could not accept that their power was a machine anyone could learn to operate. The king sent heralds to demand the archives. Velazar sent back silence. Hyun-woo expected this. A 1,000-year institution does not surrender because a king says so. The tower had its own food stores, its own water supply, its own walls thick enough to resist a siege for months. And it had 46 people inside who could produce light and heat and force from crystals they had trained with since childhood. The king wanted to storm it. Kaden urged patience. Hyun-woo agreed with Kaden for once, though their reasons were different. Kaden wanted to avoid a spectacle that might generate sympathy for the tower. Hyun-woo wanted to avoid bloodshed. He had not come this far to win by violence. He had come to win by making the tower irrelevant. He told the king to wait. Let the tower sit behind its sealed doors. Let the world move forward without it. Every day the streetlights burned was a day the tower's claim to divine necessity grew weaker. Every telegraph message that crossed the kingdom without a mage's involvement was a crack in the foundation of their myth. The king agreed reluctantly. He posted guards around the tower, not to attack, to watch, and to make sure nothing came out. Meanwhile, Hyun-woo faced a problem he had been avoiding: Grom, the merchant who owned the grain mill and who had once owned the body Hyun-woo now inhabited. Grom had watched the electrical revolution from the sidelines, with the shrewd patience of a man who always found a way to profit from other people's work. When the first streetlights went up, Grom applied to the crown for a license to manufacture bulbs. When the telegraph expanded, Grom petitioned to control the relay stations along the northern trade route, which happened to follow roads his caravans already used. When Se-rin's school began producing trained technicians, Grom offered to hire them at wages that undercut what Hyun-woo could pay. Kaden brought Grom's petitions to Hyun-woo one evening in the workshop. He said the man was clever. He said refusing him outright would create an enemy with deep pockets and guild connections. He suggested granting Grom a limited license in exchange for a share of revenue. Hyun-woo read the petitions and felt the borrowed body's memories stirring. Cold mornings, empty stomach, a hand across the mouth for speaking too slowly, the weight of a flour sack too heavy for a boy's back, and the sting of a belt when he dropped it. He set the papers down and told Kaden no. Not because of revenge, because Grom's model was the tower's model in miniature. Control the supply, extract the profit, keep the workers dependent. Hyun-woo said the licenses would go to the technicians themselves, Se-rin's graduates. They would own their own workshops and set their own prices and keep their own earnings. The knowledge was free. The textbook was free. The only requirement was that every licensed technician must take on at least one apprentice and teach them everything. Kaden frowned. He said that was inefficient. He said a centralized operation would scale faster and produce more revenue for the crown. Hyun-woo said he did not care about the crown's revenue. He cared about making sure no single person or institution could monopolize what he had built. He said, the moment one man controls all the light switches, you have a new tower. Kaden's frown deepened, but he did not argue further. The licenses went out. 12 graduates received them in the first month. They scattered across the capital and the surrounding towns, each one carrying Se-rin's textbook and a toolkit and the knowledge to build everything from a battery to a generator. Each one bound by nothing except the promise to teach. Grom came to the workshop himself on a morning when rain was hammering the streets. Hyun-woo had not seen him before. The body's memories supplied a face, but the man who walked through the door was heavier and better dressed, and older than those memories. Red-faced, thick-fingered, a smile that covered his mouth but never reached his eyes. He congratulated Hyun-woo on his success. He said he had always known the boy had potential. He said he remembered a hard-working lad in his mill who showed real promise before unfortunate circumstances separated them. Hyun-woo listened to this and felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction. The memories of pain belonged to another boy, a boy who no longer existed. He told Grom that licenses were available through the school and the requirements were public knowledge. Grom's smile thinned. He said he was not interested in attending a school. He was interested in a business arrangement. Hyun-woo said there was no arrangement to make. The technology was open. The textbook was free. Grom could learn like everyone else, or he could hire someone who had. Grom's smile vanished entirely. He looked at Hyun-woo for a long moment, and something shifted behind his small eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. He left without another word. Do-won, who had been standing in the corner the entire time, said the man would cause trouble. Hyun-woo said probably, but trouble from a merchant was manageable. Trouble from the tower was not, and the tower was stirring. On the 42nd day of the siege, the tower attacked. Not the gates, not the guards, the grid. At 3 in the morning, Hyun-woo woke to darkness, total darkness. The bulb in his room was dead. He ran to the window. The streetlights were out, every one of them. The entire capital was black. He dressed and sprinted to the palace generators. The machines were running, the water wheels turning, current flowing, but the bulbs were dead. He checked the main line, intact. He checked the transformers, functional. He checked a bulb by connecting it directly to a generator output, and it lit immediately. The problem was not the supply, it was the grid itself. Something was interfering with the current between the generators and the endpoints. He ran wire diagnostics for an hour and found nothing wrong. The copper was continuous. The connections were solid. The voltage was present at the source and absent at the destination, as if something in between was swallowing the current. Se-rin arrived at dawn. She had been running her own tests. She said the interference was not physical, it was electromagnetic. Something was generating a field strong enough to induce countercurrents in every wire in the city. The field was coming from the tower. Velazar had turned the tower itself into a weapon. 46 mages with their Godspark crystals operating in unison, generating a massive electromagnetic pulse that disrupted every circuit within range, not destroying them, just drowning them in noise. It was brilliant. It was exactly what Hyun-woo would have done if he had 46 piezoelectric transmitters and wanted to shut down an electrical grid without leaving his building. He could not outpower them, not with generators and copper. The tower's crystals were more efficient than anything he had built. They converted mechanical energy to electromagnetic radiation with almost no loss. His generators were crude by comparison. He needed a different approach. He sat in the workshop and thought. Se-rin sat across from him and thought. Do-han sat in the corner and sharpened his knife and waited. The answer came from Se-rin. She had been reading her father's notes again, the oldest ones, the ones written in a hand that was not Eun's. She had found a passage about resonance, about how the crystals operated at specific frequencies. Each crystal had a natural frequency, determined by its size and shape and composition. The tower's jamming field would be centered on those frequencies. If Hyun-woo could shield his wires from those specific frequencies, the grid would function again. Shielding. Faraday cage. A grounded conductive enclosure blocks external electromagnetic fields. He could not cage the entire city, but he could cage the wires. He could wrap every critical line in a grounded metal sheath that would absorb the tower's interference and redirect it to the earth. Iron pipe. Do-han could make iron pipe. Not for the whole grid. That would take months. But for the main trunk lines from the generators to the key distribution points, 15 critical segments, maybe 200 meters total. Do-won said he could forge that much pipe in 4 days if he had help. Tal and Kem arrived from the northern town the next morning, summoned by telegraph before the grid went down. With 5 of them working the forge, they produced pipe in 3 days. They installed it at night, crawling through streets in darkness, bolting iron sheaths around copper lines, grounding each segment with iron rods driven deep into the earth. On the 4th night, Hyun-woo connected the shielded main lines to the generators and threw the switch. The streetlights on the central avenue blazed to life. Not all of them, only the ones connected to shielded lines, but enough. Enough to break the darkness the tower had imposed, enough to show the city that the tower's counterstrike had failed. The people came out of their houses. They stood in the light and looked up at the burning bulbs, and then they looked at the tower's dark spire rising against the stars. And for the first time, the tower looked small. Morning came, and the shielded lines held. The tower's jamming field hummed uselessly against iron pipe and grounded earth rods. Velazar had played his strongest card, and it had bought him 4 days of darkness. Hyun-woo spent those days thinking about what came next. The tower could not jam the grid anymore. It could not leave its sealed gates without facing the king's guards. It had no allies left in the court. Caden had seen to that. The 3 mages who had defected during the throne room confrontation had been joined by 11 more who slipped out through service tunnels during the siege. They brought crystals and knowledge and confirmation of everything Hyun-woo had claimed. The tower's archives were partially reconstructed from their testimony, diagrams of the original devices, histories written in a cipher that Se-rin cracked in 2 weeks, the truth laid bare. A civilization that had discovered electromagnetism 1,000 years ago, a catastrophe that destroyed most of that civilization. A small group of survivors who preserved the knowledge in crystal form and decided that the world was not ready for it. That decision became doctrine. Doctrine became religion. Religion became the tower. And the tower became a cage for all of humanity, built by people who believed they were protecting it. Hyun-woo understood Velazar now. The Archmage was not simply greedy or power-hungry. He was a true believer. He believed the world would destroy itself with this knowledge, just as the previous civilization had. He believed the tower's 1,000-year suppression was mercy. He believed Hyun-woo was unleashing a catastrophe. He was wrong, but he was sincere. And that made him more dangerous than any cynic, because a cynic can be bought, and a true believer can only be broken. On the 60th day, the tower doors opened. Not because Velazar surrendered, because the mages inside chose to leave. They came out one by one over the course of a morning, blinking in sunlight they had not seen in 2 months. Some were angry, some were relieved, some were crying. They left their robes at the door. 31 mages walked out. 15 remained with Velazar. The ones who came out told the same story. Food had run low weeks ago. Water was rationed. Velazar had kept them together through sheer force of will and the promise that the king would relent. When the grid came back online after the jamming failed, something broke inside the tower. The younger mages began to argue, then to shout, then to leave. Velazar let them go. He did not try to stop them. He stood at the top of the central staircase and watched them file out, and said nothing. The king's soldiers entered the tower that afternoon. They found the archives, rooms and rooms of them, crystal storage vaults, diagrams etched on metal plates that would last 10,000 years, texts in languages that no living person could read, and devices, hundreds of devices, machines that converted crystal resonance into light and heat and motion, machines that purified water, machines that transmitted sound across distances, an entire technological civilization preserved in amber, waiting for someone to understand it. Se-rin walked through the archive rooms and wept, not from grief, from recognition. Her father had spent his life searching for fragments of this, scraps and hints and half-burned pages, and here it all was, complete, untouched, hidden behind locked doors while the world outside starved for knowledge. Hyun-woo found Velazar on the top floor of the tower. The old archmage sat in a chair by a window that overlooked the city. The electric lights were burning below. Street lights and workshop lights, and the warm glow from windows where families sat in brightness that had once been reserved for palaces. Velazar did not look at Hyun-woo when he entered. He spoke to the window. He said the last civilization had called it the Age of Lightning. He said they had built cities that floated on electromagnetic fields and weapons that could level mountains from 1,000 miles away. He said they had connected every mind to every other mind through networks of crystal and wire, and the result was not enlightenment. It was war. Total war. War that burned the sky and poisoned the earth and left nothing but rubble and a handful of survivors who swore it would never happen again. Those survivors built the tower. They hid the knowledge. They wrapped it in ritual so that only a few could access it. And those few were bound by oaths and hierarchy and the threat of expulsion. It was not about power, not at first. It was about fear. Fear that humanity would do it again. Hyun-woo sat down across from him. He said he understood. He said the fear was reasonable. He said any tool powerful enough to build a city is powerful enough to destroy one. He said the survivors had made a choice that he could not call entirely wrong. But he said that choice had a cost. 1,000 years of darkness. 1,000 years of people dying from cold and disease and ignorance that did not have to exist. Children going blind from working in candlelight. Scholars burned for asking questions. An entire world held in poverty so that a few could sleep safely knowing the weapons would never be rebuilt. He said the tower had traded a possible catastrophe for a certain one. A slow catastrophe. A quiet one. The kind that kills not with fire, but with the absence of light. Velazar was quiet for a long time. The electric lights burned below them. Somewhere in the streets, a child was laughing. The old man's hands lay in his lap, the hands that had once held divine fire. The hands that had tried to burn Hyun-woo in the throne room. They were still now, trembling slightly. He asked Hyun-woo what would stop this civilization from destroying itself the way the last one had. Hyun-woo said nothing. Nothing would stop it. No lock and no tower and no secret could guarantee that humanity would not misuse what it learned. The only thing that helped was making sure the knowledge belonged to everyone. Because when one group holds all the power, the question is not whether they will abuse it, but when. When everyone holds it, the abuse is harder. Not impossible, but harder. He said the tower had proven this. A small group with a monopoly on knowledge had become exactly the tyrants the founders feared. Not because they were evil, but because monopoly corrupts by its nature. The only defense against tyranny is distribution. Velazar said that was a child's answer. Hyun-woo said maybe. But a child's answer that lights every house in a city was better than a wise man's answer that kept them all in darkness. The old archmage looked at him then. Really looked at him. And whatever he saw made him close his eyes and lower his head. He did not speak again. Hyun-woo left him there by the window. He walked down through the archive rooms where Se-rin and her students were already cataloging the crystal vaults. He walked through the tower doors into the street where Do-han was supervising the installation of new power lines to the eastern quarter. He walked past the school where 40 students had become 60, and the sound of their questions filled the air like birdsong. He walked to the central avenue where the streetlights burned in their steady rows, and a woman was selling roasted chestnuts beneath one of them, and her cart cast a clean shadow on the paving stones. He stopped there. He bought a bag of chestnuts. They were hot and sweet, and they tasted like a world that was waking up. Behind him, the tower stood open. Its doors would never close again. Ahead of him, the avenue stretched into a city that glowed with light, built by human hands for human hands. No priests, no rituals, no chosen ones, just copper and iron and knowledge written in a book that anyone could read. He thought about the boy whose body he wore, the boy who had been beaten and starved and told he was nothing. That boy was gone, but the body remained. And it stood taller now, and its hands were calloused from wire and copper and the good, honest work of building something that would outlast them all. The chestnuts were warm in his palms. The lights burned overhead. Somewhere in the school, Se-rin was teaching a girl how to wind a coil, and the girl's eyes were wide with understanding. And that understanding would spread to the next person, and the next, and the next, until there was no corner of this world that the light could not reach. Lee Hyeon-woo, the engineer from Incheon substation number 4, stood under the electric stars he had built and ate his chestnuts and watched the people walk in light. The darkness was over. Not because one man had brought fire from the heavens, because he had shown them that the fire was already theirs.